The entire Harry Potter series is fundamentally a meditation on death and mortality, though this central theme often goes unnoticed by younger readers enchanted by the surface magic. From the very first page, when Lily Potter dies to save her son, to the final confrontation where Harry walks willingly toward his own death, J.K. Rowling built a philosophical framework about accepting mortality as the natural order of things. The villain's deepest flaw isn't his cruelty or ambition, but his pathological fear of death, his desperate attempt to split his soul into fragments to achieve immortality at any cost. Voldemort's very name, flight from death, in French telegraphs his defining weakness. Meanwhile, the story's heroes are those who accept death, as Dumbledore describes it, the next great adventure. This acceptance versus denial of mortality creates the moral axis on which the entire narrative turns. The Deathly Hallows themselves serve as tests of character, with the Resurrection Stone particularly dangerous because it tempts the grieving to cling unhealthily to the dead. When Harry finally understands that the stone should be dropped, lost in the forest rather than used, he demonstrates the mature wisdom that Voldemort never achieves. For adult readers, especially those who have experienced real loss, this philosophical depth transforms the series from adventure story into genuine literature about the human condition. Dumbledore's complexity becomes staggering when viewed through adult eyes, particularly his calculated decision to raise Harry like a pig for slaughter, as Snape so brutally observes. Throughout 7 years at Hogwarts, Dumbledore withholds crucial information from Harry, allowing the boy to grow attached to life, to friendships, to hope, all while knowing Harry contains a piece of Voldemort's soul and must eventually die. This isn't portrayed as villainy, but as agonizing necessity, a trolley problem on a grand scale where one life must end to save thousands. Yet it's manipulation nonetheless. However, Dumbledore orchestrates Harry's entire existence from infancy, placing him with abusive relatives to keep him humble, engineering his path through school to build specific qualities, even arranging his own death to ensure Harry discovers the truth at precisely the right moment. For younger readers, Dumbledore is simply the wise mentor. For adults, he becomes a man carrying impossible moral weight, making utilitarian calculations that sacrifice individuals for collective good. Haunted by mistakes from his own youth, when he too dreamed of power and domination, his relationship with Grindelwald adds another layer, the brilliant young man seduced by ideology, planning wizard supremacy for the greater good, until his sister's death shattered those ambitions. That trauma shaped everything that followed, every choice Dumbledore made in steering Harry's life. The complexity here isn't good versus evil, but flawed humans struggling with impossible choices, bearing the weight of knowledge that sometimes love requires sacrifice, even manipulation, in service of survival. The Ministry of Magic's corruption mirrors historical collapses of democratic institutions with uncomfortable accuracy, something adult readers recognize immediately, but children might miss entirely. Cornelius Fudge's denial of Voldemort's return isn't simple cowardice, political self-preservation at its most craven. A man choosing his career over truth, his comfort over public safety. He launches systematic smear campaigns against Harry and Dumbledore, using the Daily Prophet as state propaganda to discredit the only voice's warning of danger. This manipulation of media and information, the weaponization of public trust, reads differently to adults who have witnessed similar patterns in real-world politics. Fudge's show trial of Harry for underage magic, the Wisingomet stacked with his supporters, the intimidation tactics. These aren't fantasy, but recognizable authoritarian moves, dressed in robes and magical lore. When Voldemort finally reveals himself, and Fudge has no choice but to acknowledge reality, he's already damaged the Ministry's credibility so thoroughly that institutional collapse becomes inevitable. Scrimgeour, who follows, proves little better, attempting to use Harry as propaganda, as a poster boy for false hope, while the Ministry crumbles from within. The system fails not because evil is too powerful, but because those in power prioritize maintaining power over serving the people they're meant to protect. For adults watching governments struggle with crisis, pandemics, wars, economic collapse, the Ministry's failure resonates as cautionary tale about what happens when institutions value appearance over function, politics over truth. Dolores Umbridge represents something more disturbing than Voldemort ever could: the banality of evil, ordinary bureaucratic cruelty that destroys lives with paperwork and pink bows. While Voldemort is obviously, dramatically evil, Umbridge is the person who actually exists in every society. The small-minded authoritarian who climbs to power through systems and procedures, who tortures not from ideology but from petty vindictiveness and need for control. Her educational decrees at Hogwarts mirror real-world erosion of freedoms through seemingly reasonable regulations, each one tightening control while claiming to restore order. She bans student groups, censors education, forbids practical defense training, all while maintaining a veneer of propriety with her kitten plates and girlish voice. The blood quill she uses on Harry, forcing him to carve words into his own flesh, represents torture sanitized by authority, punishment that leaves permanent scars but can be dismissed as lines in detention. Adult readers recognize Umbridge immediately because most have encountered someone like her. The middle manager, drunk on tiny power. The bureaucrat who inflicts suffering because they can. The person who hides cruelty behind rules and regulations. She's more hateable than the Dark Lord because she's real, because we've all suffered under someone exactly like her. When she leads the Muggle-born Registration Commission under Voldemort's regime, it surprises no one people like Umbridge don't need ideological conviction to participate in atrocities. They just need authority and permission. She would serve any master who gave her power. Blood purity ideology in Harry Potter isn't subtle metaphor but direct parallel to racial supremacy movements throughout human history, something children might miss but adults recognize immediately. The term mudblood functions exactly like racial slurs, marking those with Muggle heritage as inherently inferior, polluted, less than fully human. The obsession with bloodlines, the family trees tracing pure lineage, the disownment of blood traders who associate with the wrong people. These mirror eugenic movements and apartheid systems with uncomfortable precision. Slytherin's Chamber of Secrets, designed to purge the school of Muggle-born students, is ethnic cleansing in magical form, genocide prevented only by a 12-year-old boy and a phoenix. The Death Eaters' ideology, particularly during their control of the Ministry in the final book, escalates from prejudice to systematic persecution, Muggle-born, registration, seizure of property, show trials, imprisonment. J. Rowling makes the parallels clear without being heavy-handed, trusting adult readers to recognize the patterns. What adds devastating irony is that Voldemort himself, the movement's leader, is half-blood. His hatred fueled not by genuine belief in pure blood superiority, but by self-loathing and desperate need to belong to something greater than his Muggle father's abandonment. Severus Snape, another half-blood, joins the Death Eaters partly from similar need-working class, boy from abusive home, seeking power and identity in ideology that promises him superiority over those who bullied him. The pure-blood families, like the Malfoys and Blacks, maintain their prejudice through generational indoctrination, each generation teaching the next that Muggles and Muggle-borns are lesser. Breaking these cycles, as serious attempts, requires tremendous courage and often results in being disowned, erased from family trees, cast out from the only community you've known. The Dursleys' treatment of Harry constitutes clear child abuse, something adult readers recognize immediately, while younger readers might simply see it as mean relatives. Harry sleeps in a cupboard under the stairs for 11 years, not a bedroom, denied adequate food while Dudley receives whatever he wants, forced to wear Dudley's enormous cast-off clothing, punished for things beyond his control, like accidental magic, Vernon Dursley's explosive rage, Petunia's cold neglect, the emotional manipulation of telling Harry his parents died in a car crash because they were drunken. Layabouts, this is systematic psychological abuse designed to crush the child's spirit and self-worth. The Dursleys don't just dislike Harry, they actively attempt to stamp out anything special about him, to make him small and invisible and ashamed of existing. Adult readers, especially those who work with children or have experienced family dysfunction, recognize these patterns as genuinely damaging, not comic relief. The question that haunts mature rereading is why Dumbledore left Harry there year after year, returning him every summer despite knowing about the abuse. The explanation about Lily's blood protection feels insufficient when weighed against a child's welfare. Dumbledore admits he prioritized Harry's survival over Harry's happiness, kept him deliberately downtrodden to prevent arrogance. Another utilitarian calculation that sacrifices a child's emotional well-being for strategic advantage. The Dursleys shaped Harry in ways that served the narrative: his humility, his fierce loyalty to those who show him kindness, his willingness to sacrifice himself, but the cost was a childhood of neglect and emotional starvation that would realistically leave deeper scars than the story fully explores. Harry exhibits clear symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder throughout the series, particularly in his 5th year. Though the books never use that clinical terminology, he experiences recurring nightmares of Cedric's death and Voldemort's return, often waking in terror covered in sweat. His anger becomes explosive and uncontrolled, lashing out at friends who are trying to help him, unable to regulate his emotional responses to minor frustrations. He shows hypervigilance, constantly checking his surroundings, expecting attack. He has intrusive thoughts and visions, experiencing Voldemort's emotions through their connection, unable to distinguish his own feelings from the Dark Lord's fury. He isolates himself, pushing away Ron and Hermione, convinced he's dangerous to be around. These are textbook trauma responses, yet Harry receives no real support, no counseling, no therapy, no adult helping him process witnessing a classmate's murder at 14. Dumbledore's strategy of ignoring Harry all year, refusing to make eye contact, abandoning him without explanation, is precisely the opposite of trauma-informed care. Adults reading this recognize how desperately Harry needed help he never received, how the magical world apparently has no concept of mental health support, despite having potions for every ailment and spells for every purpose. The closest thing to therapy Harry gets is talking to Sirius through fireplaces and sharing experiences with those who understand. Luna, who watched her mother die in an experiment gone wrong, or Neville, whose parents were tortured into permanent insanity. The series treats trauma as something you simply endure and overcome through determination, very British in its stiff upper lip approach. But adult readers might wish someone had simply asked Harry if he was okay and actually listened to the answer. Frank and Alice Longbottom's fate represents something worse than death, permanent psychological destruction that leaves the body alive but the person gone. They were tortured with the Cruciatus curse until their minds shattered completely, leaving them in St. Mungo's hospital with no recognition of their own son, no connection to reality, reduced to giving Neville candy wrappers as the only interaction they're capable of offering. For adults, particularly those who have witnessed dementia or severe mental illness in loved ones, this hits differently than it does for children reading about brave Aurors who fought Death Eaters. The scene where Neville visits his parents during the Christmas holiday, where his mother gives him a candy wrapper and he quietly pockets it, carries devastating weight. His grandmother dismisses the gesture as meaningless, but Neville keeps every wrapper, the only gift his mother can still give. The Longbottom's condition reflects the permanent cost of the First Wizarding War. Casualties who survived physically but were destroyed in every way that matters. Families shattered not by death but by something arguably worse, the utter absence of the person while their body remains. Neville's entire character arc, his transformation from frightened boy to war leader, gains depth when you understand he's carrying this trauma, growing up with parents who exist but cannot be parents, shaped by loss without the finality of mourning. The cruelty of the Cruciatus curse isn't just the pain it inflicts in the moment, but its capacity to annihilate the self, to remove personhood while leaving the flesh intact. Adult readers recognize this as commentary on torture's true evil, not that it hurts, but that it destroys what makes us human. Severus Snape's complexity epitomizes the series' mature moral landscape, presenting a man who is simultaneously abusive teacher and genuine hero, petty bully and brave spy, whose love for Lily Potter motivated both his worst and best choices. Children reading the series might see Snape's redemption as simple good guy reveal, but adults recognize something more uncomfortably, can be cruel and brave simultaneously, motivated by love while still inflicting real harm on children in your care. Snape's classroom behavior toward Harry, Hermione, and Neville crosses lines regularly, mocking students, playing favorites, allowing bullying, even threatening to poison Neville's pet to test an antidote. This is genuine emotional abuse from a teacher, regardless of his secret heroism. Yet, simultaneously he protects students at great personal risk, maintains his cover as Voldemort's servant for years, demonstrates extraordinary courage in service of Dumbledore's plans. His love for Lily, obsessive, never returned, enduring decades past her death, drove him to switch sides. But it's possessive love, shadowed by his earlier choices to join Death Eaters, to relay the prophecy that got her killed. The always moment, his silver doe Patronus matching hers, reads as romantic to some readers but disturbing to others, who notice he loved a woman who never wanted him, nursed that flame for 20 years, transferred his complicated feelings onto her son in ways both protective and punishing. Snape's arc asks difficult questions about redemption and forgiveness that children aren't equipped to wrestle with. Can Good deeds erase cruelty. Does sacrifice redeem abuse? Should we celebrate him or condemn him? The answer, uncomfortably, is both. The house elf enslavement represents institutionalized oppression, so normalized that even good wizards participate without question, something that becomes deeply disturbing through adult eyes, examining systemic injustice. House elves are bound to families through magic, compelled to obey commands, unable to speak ill of masters even when abused, punishing themselves for perceived failures by ironing their hands or hitting their heads against walls. This is slavery, pure and simple. Yet the magical world accepts it as natural order. Hermione's activism through SPEW is treated as joke by most characters, as naive teenage idealism, even though she's identifying clear moral atrocity. The excuse that house elves like to serve mirrors historical justifications of slavery, almost word for word, claiming enslaved peoples were happy in bondage, suited for servitude. Some elves, like Creature and Winky, have indeed internalized their oppression to the point of defending it, showing how thoroughly subjugation can warp psychology when maintained across generations. Dobby's desire for freedom is treated as aberration. Hermione's attempts to free Hogwarts elves through hidden hats seen as misguided rather than righteous. The series never fully resolves this moral issue. House elves remain enslaved at the end. No liberation movement succeeds. The most we get is kindness toward individual elves, rather than systemic change. Adult readers notice this failure. How Rowling identified a profound injustice, but couldn't or wouldn't imagine its abolition, settling instead for reformed slavery rather than freedom. It's one of the series' most troubling unresolved elements, particularly for readers sensitive to historical parallels and ongoing struggles against human trafficking and forced labor. Sirius Black's 12 years in Azkaban destroyed him psychologically in ways he never recovers from, leaving him a shell of the charismatic rebel he once was. Azkaban, guarded by Dementors who drain happiness and force prisoners to relive their worst memories, represents incarceration as systematic psychological torture. Sirius endured over a decade surrounded by creatures that feed on despair, with no trial, no conviction, imprisoned for crimes he didn't commit, while the actual traitor lived free. When he escapes and reconnects with Harry, he's damaged in fundamental ways, reckless, unable to distinguish past from present, projecting onto Harry his relationship with James, taking dangerous risks because he's lost the capacity to value his own survival. He survived Azkaban only by transforming into a dog, his animagus form less affected by Dementors than human consciousness. But even that coping mechanism speaks to how thoroughly he had to fragment his psyche just to endure, his death falling through a veil that separates life and death, gone in an instant. During battlefields almost inevitable given his damaged state, his inability to protect himself because he never properly healed. Adult readers, particularly those familiar with the long-term effects of trauma and solitary confinement, recognize Sirius as man whom the system broke, who never got the time or support needed to become whole again. The magical world has no concept of rehabilitation, no therapy for trauma, no acknowledgement that 12 years of torture might require actual healing beyond just being free. Sirius tries to be Harry's godfather, tries to provide the family Harry desperately needs, but he's too shattered himself, two damaged people reaching for connection, neither is equipped to fully provide. The prophecy about Harry and Voldemort reveals the arbitrary nature of fate and choice, in ways that resonate more deeply with adult readers. Trelawney's prediction could have applied to either Harry or Neville Longbottom, both born as the 7th month died, both to parents who had thrice defied Voldemort, but Voldemort chose Harry, marked him as his equal, and in that choice created the very enemy the prophecy foretold. This is classic self-fulfilling prophecy, where attempting to prevent a prediction causes its fulfillment. Adults recognize the philosophical depth here. The prophecy had no inherent power until Voldemort gave it power by acting on it, until he murdered Lily and James and created the exact circumstances that would lead to his downfall. Dumbledore tries to explain this to Harry. It matters not what the prophecy said, but what Voldemort believed it said, what choices were made in response. Yet the prophecy still weighs on Harry throughout the series, this sense that his entire existence has been predestined for confrontation with Voldemort, that he has no choice in his heroism. The mature reading recognizes that Harry does have choice. He could have walked away, could have refused the role thrust upon him, but he chooses to fight because of who he is, because of love and loyalty and moral conviction, not because prophecy compelled him. The prophecy becomes symbol for how we make our own fate through our choices while simultaneously feeling trapped by circumstances beyond our control. How free will and destiny intertwine in ways that defy simple separation. Remus Lupin's internalized shame about his lycanthropy serves as painful metaphor for stigmatized conditions, particularly chronic illness and HIV/AIDS, given when Rowling was writing these books. Lupin is gentle, kind, brilliant, an excellent teacher and loyal friend, but he's spent his entire life convinced he's a monster because of something beyond his control. He was bitten as a child, infected before he could consent, yet he carries the shame as though it's moral failing rather than misfortune. The magical world's treatment of werewolves, legislative discrimination, employment barriers, social ostracism mirrors real-world prejudice against people with stigmatized conditions. Lupin can't find steady work despite obvious qualifications, forced to live in poverty, denied dignity because of his monthly transformation. His brief time teaching at Hogwarts represents rare acceptance, but even that ends when Snape maliciously reveals his condition, knowing it will destroy Lupin's reputation and force his resignation. The self-hatred Lupin carries runs so deep he tries to abandon his pregnant wife, convinced he's cursed their unborn child, certain that loving him was Tonks's terrible mistake. Adult readers, particularly those who have experienced stigma around illness, disability, or marginalized identity, recognize Lupin's internalized oppression, how thoroughly he's absorbed society's hatred and turned it inward. His death in the Battle of Hogwarts, leaving his infant son orphaned as Harry was orphaned, carries tragic irony. Teddy will grow up without his father, just as Remus grew up marked and marginalized. Cycles of loss repeating across generations. The werewolf metaphor isn't perfect, and some critics rightly point out its limitations. But Lupin's character explores how stigma damages even when the stigmatized person has done nothing wrong. How prejudice becomes internalized until you believe the lies told about you. The decision to use child soldiers in the fight against Voldemort becomes increasingly disturbing as adult readers consider the ethical implications. Dumbledore's army starts as students teaching each other defensive magic because their government-appointed teacher refuses to let them practice, which seems reasonable enough. But by the final book, these teenagers are fighting in actual warfare, 17-year-olds and younger battling Death Eaters, casting lethal curses, watching classmates die. The Battle of Hogwarts sees students defending their school, which reads as heroic when you're young, but becomes ethically complicated from adult perspective. These are children, legally speaking, thrust into combat against adult wizards who use torture, curses, and kill without hesitation. Neville leads resistance at Hogwarts, while it's controlled by Death Eaters, enduring punishment from the Carrows, recruiting students into guerrilla warfare. Ginny, only 16, fights in the Chamber of Secrets battle, and later at Hogwarts. Colin Creevey, only 16, and not even of age, sneaks back to fight, and dies for his trouble. The Adults Order of the Phoenix members, teachers, parents allow this to happen, even enable it, because they need every wand in the fight for survival. There's no time for childhood when fascism takes over, no luxury of protecting youth from war when war comes to their doorstep. Adult readers recognize this pattern from real-world conflicts where children become soldiers by necessity, where civil wars erase the boundaries between combatant and civilian, where survival requires everyone capable of fighting to fight. It's not comfortable or clean or noble in the simple way children's literature usually portrays heroism. It's desperate and tragic and wrong, even when necessary. Tom Riddle's transformation into Voldemort represents the ultimate consequences of childhood trauma left unhealed and twisted into megalomaniacal hatred. Born in an orphanage, abandoned by his mother who died giving birth, rejected by the father who never knew he existed, Tom grew up with no love, no family, no softness in his world. When Dumbledore visits to invite him to Hogwarts, young Tom has already developed disturbing behaviors, stealing from other children, hurting animals, using his magic to punish and control. The orphanage staff fear him. He has no friends, no positive attachments. At Hogwarts he's brilliant and charming in public, while secretly opening the Chamber of Secrets, murdering Moaning Myrtle, framing Hagrid, creating his first Horcrux by killing his own father. Adult readers recognize the psychological profile here. A child who never learned empathy because no one showed him empathy, who never learned love because no one loved him, who filled the void where attachment should be with need for power and control. This doesn't excuse his choices. Plenty of people survive terrible childhoods without becoming genocidal dark wizards, but it contextualizes them. Voldemort's fear of death stems directly from having never truly lived, never experienced the connections that make mortality bearable. His obsession with blood purity masks self-hatred about his half-blood status, projection of his shame about his Muggle father onto all Muggleborns, his inability to understand love as power, his dismissal of it as weakness, reflects someone who never received it and thus cannot comprehend its strength. The tragedy isn't that we should pity Voldemort, but that we can trace the line from abandoned child to monster and recognize how cruelty begets cruelty, how trauma untended metastasizes into evil. The Daily Prophet's role as propaganda arm for whatever regime holds power demonstrates how media manipulation enables authoritarianism, something adult readers find disturbingly familiar. Under Fudge's ministry, the Prophet runs systematic smear campaigns against Harry and Dumbledore, printing lies, distorting facts, character assassination, masquerading as journalism. Rita Skeeter embodies unethical journalism at its worst. She fabricates quotes, invades privacy through illegal means, her unregistered animagus form, sensationalizes tragedy, ruins reputations for career advancement. When the ministry falls to Voldemort, the Prophet seamlessly transitions to serving new masters, now printing pureblood propaganda. Wanted posters for Muggleborns, lies about Harry being undesirable. Number 1. The speed of this transition reveals that the Prophet was never actually committed to truth or ethics, only to serving power and maintaining circulation. This isn't just fantasy. Adult readers recognize patterns from historical dictatorships and contemporary struggles with media bias, misinformation, and journalists who prioritize access to power over accountability. Hermione's realization that books and newspapers can lie, that published information isn't necessarily reliable, represents loss of innocence for someone who trusted written word above all else. The Quibbler, dismissed as tabloid nonsense by most of magical society, ends up publishing more truth than the respectable Prophet because it's willing to print unpopular facts. Adult readers appreciate this irony that fringe publications sometimes tell truths mainstream media won't touch, that respectability and accuracy don't always align. The media's failure in Harry Potter serves as warning about what happens when journalism abandons independence for influence, when newspapers become mouthpieces rather than watchdogs. Percy Weasley's estrangement from his family reveals how ambition and ideology can sever even the deepest bonds, particularly when mixed with class anxiety and desperate need to prove oneself. Percy is the classic middle child overachiever, trying to distinguish himself in family of remarkable siblings, seeking validation through rules and achievement. His promotion to Fudge's junior assistant represents everything he's worked for: validation from authority figures, escape from being just another Weasley. When his family sides with Dumbledore against the ministry, Percy faces impossible choice: family or career, love or ambition, and he chooses career. He sends his Hogwarts head boy badge back to Ron, cuts off contact, even refuses to see his father after Arthur is attacked and nearly killed by Nagini. For 2 years, Percy remains estranged, working for Fudge and then Skungor, choosing ministry side even as evidence mounts that his family was right about Voldemort's return. Adult readers, particularly those who have experienced family rifts over politics or ideology, recognize the psychology here: how pride makes reconciliation impossible, how admitting you were wrong feels unbearable, how you double down on bad choices rather than face shame of reversal. Percy's return during the Battle of Hogwarts, his reconciliation with his family just before Fred dies in the fighting, carries devastating weight. He gets his brother back just in time to lose him forever, gets to reconcile only to have the guilt of those lost years become permanent. It's realistic in its messiness. Families do fracture over politics and pride, do lose precious time they can never recover. Percy's arc warns against letting ideology or ambition override love, against choosing respectability over relationship, while acknowledging how easily these choices happen, how pride becomes trap. Cedric Diggory's death represents the loss of innocence, not just for Harry, but for the entire wizarding world. The moment when Voldemort's return becomes undeniable reality soaked in blood. Cedric is the golden boy, handsome, talented, kind, popular, everything a Hogwarts champion should be. His selection alongside Harry for the Triwizard Tournament seems like friendly competition between worthy representatives. Then, in an instant, in a graveyard far from spectators, Cedric becomes collateral damage, killed simply for being present when Voldemort needed Harry alone. The curse hits him before he can even defend himself, before he understands what's happening, reducing a 17-year-old life to spare to be eliminated. For Harry, who witnessed it, who heard Cedric's father's anguished screams upon receiving his son's body, this trauma never fades. He relives it in nightmares, sees Cedric's death every time he encounters Dementors, carries guilt for surviving when Cedric didn't. Adult readers recognize this as survivor's guilt, as the weight of witnessing sudden death, as trauma that should require professional support Harry never receives. Cedric's death also marks shift in the series' tone from magical boarding school adventures to genuine war story, from conflicts that resolve neatly to losses that can't be fixed. His parents' grief, Amos Diggory's collapse, the reality that good people die senselessly in Worthy's adult truths, intrude on what had been relatively safe narrative territory. The memorial feast at year's end, Dumbledore's insistence on acknowledging what happened rather than hiding it, represents a crucial moment of communal grief, though it can't erase the horror of what Harry experienced alone in that graveyard. The Imperious Curse and its use raises deeply troubling questions about consent, free will, and moral responsibility when one's actions are controlled by another. Under Imperious, witches and wizards have no choice but to obey commands. They will completely subjugated to the caster's desires. Many Death Eaters after the First Wizarding War claimed they acted under Imperious, that they weren't responsible for their crimes, and the question of how to prove it either way haunts the wizarding justice system. Some claims were surely true. Barty Crouch Jr. kept his father under Imperious for extended periods, and we see the devastating effects, but others clearly lied, using the curse as convenient excuse to escape punishment while having willingly participated in atrocities. The curse's existence creates impossible moral quandaries. How do you hold someone accountable for actions they were magically compelled to perform? How do you prove whether someone was truly controlled or claiming it falsely? When Harry learns to resist the Imperious Curse through Mad-Eye Moody's, actually Barty Crouch Jr.'s teaching, we learn resistance is possible with sufficient willpower, which further complicates matters. If you can resist, are you culpable for not resisting? Adult readers recognize parallels to real-world questions about coercion, duress, and moral responsibility when someone acts under threat or control. The curse also appears in deeply disturbing contexts. It's used to force people into complicity, to make victims participate in their own oppression, to create false consent that isn't consent at all. When Death Eaters force someone under Imperious to betray friends or commit crimes, the violation extends beyond physical control into moral territory, forcing people to act against their deepest values. Dumbledore's death, arranged by Dumbledore himself as final act of manipulation and sacrifice, demonstrates his utilitarian philosophy taken to its logical extreme. He's already dying from the curse on Marvolo Gaunt's ring, already doomed, so he arranges for Snape to kill him on the Astronomy Tower to achieve multiple strategic objectives: preserve Draco's soul by preventing the boy from committing murder, maintain Snape's cover as Voldemort's loyal servant, prevent the Elder Wand's power from passing to a Death Eater, ensure Harry learns about Horcruxes at precisely the right moment. Dumbledore orchestrates his own murder the way he orchestrated everything else, controlling variables, sacrificing himself as he sacrificed Harry, all in service of defeating Voldemort. For adult readers, this is both admirable and deeply troubling: the cold calculation required to plan your own death, to manipulate your killer into killing you, to use even your final moments as strategic advantage. Dumbledore dies as he lived, playing wizard chess with human pieces, though this time he's the piece being sacrificed. The scene hits differently on rereading when you know Snape is following Dumbledore's orders, that the hatred and revulsion on Snape's face masks anguish at having to kill the man who trusted him, that Dumbledore's plea, Severus please, was permission not begging. The funeral scene, with its formal mourning and testimonials, provides closure Harry desperately needs, but it can't erase the manipulation inherent in Dumbledore's choices, the way he controlled everyone around him, including the manner of his death. Adult readers grapple with whether this level of manipulation can be justified, even when motivated by love and desperate need to defeat evil. Draco Malfoy's sixth year reveals the human cost of ideological indoctrination when children are forced to live out their parents' beliefs. Draco has spent his entire life absorbing pure-blood supremacy from his father, learning to despise Muggleborns, expecting to join Death Eaters as natural progression. But when Voldemort actually tasks him with murdering Dumbledore, Draco discovers he's not actually capable of cold-blooded killing. He's 16, terrified, in over his head, stuck between Voldemort's threat to kill his entire family and his own inability to commit murder. Throughout the year, he deteriorates, losing weight, looking ill, crying in bathroom while Harry eavesdrops, clearly crumbling under pressure no teenager should bear. The scene on the astronomy tower where Draco has Dumbledore wandless but cannot bring himself to cast the killing curse represents moral awakening, the moment when abstract ideology meets concrete reality and the child realizes he doesn't want to be what his parents raised him to be. Yet he's trapped. Refusing means death for his family. Accepting means destroying his own soul. Adult readers recognize this as tragedy of indoctrination, how children inherit their parents' hatreds but aren't necessarily suited to carry them forward, how ideological movements consume their own children when those children develop actual moral awareness. Draco's redemption isn't complete or neat. He doesn't switch sides dramatically, doesn't denounce his family, mostly just survives and seems grateful to be alive at the end. But his inability to murder Dumbledore, his mother's lie to Voldemort to protect him, represent cracks in the pure-blood ideology that raised him, small human moments that ideology cannot fully suppress. The Carrow's control of Hogwarts during the final book transforms the school from safe haven into instrument of state oppression, demonstrating how education becomes battleground when fascists take power. Alecto and Amicus Carrow teach Muggle studies and defense against the dark arts respectively, but their real curriculum is indoctrination and cruelty. They teach that Muggles are animals, that Muggleborns stole magic from purebloods, propaganda disguised as history. They use Cruciator's curse on students as punishment, turning the school into torture chamber. Students who resist face violence, detention becomes abuse, learning becomes survival. This reflects historical reality of how authoritarian regimes target education first. Control what children learn, control what they believe, shape the next generation to accept oppression as normal. Neville's resistance, recruiting students into underground opposition, painting graffiti messages, helping protect younger students from Carrow's worst excesses, represents heroism born of impossible circumstances. He and others face daily threat of torture, but continue resisting because surrendering means accepting that Hogwarts, their home, has become something evil. Adult readers recognize these patterns from real-world occupations and dictatorships, where schools become sites of resistance, precisely because controlling young minds is so crucial to maintaining power. The fact that 17-year-olds have to protect 14-year-olds from teachers who torture them reveals how completely the normal order has collapsed, how war erases childhood and forces students to become soldiers whether they want that role or not. Hermione's decision to modify her parents' memories and send them to Australia represents heartbreaking sacrifice that often goes unnoticed among more dramatic plot points. She doesn't just say goodbye, she erases herself from their lives, makes them forget they ever had a daughter, to protect them from being tortured for information or killed. To punish her, she destroys their memories of her childhood, her birth, their love for her, everything they shared, and she does it alone without telling them because telling them would defeat the purpose. For adult readers, particularly parents, this sacrifice carries enormous weight. Imagine forgetting your child ever existed, living happily in Australia with no knowledge that you had a daughter who loved you enough to erase herself from your life. Hermione carries this grief silently while hunting Horcruxes, while camping in forests, while facing capture and torture, knowing her parents are safe but have no idea who she is. The books never show her restoring their memories after the war, leaving this sacrifice potentially permanent, which makes it even more devastating. It's the kind of mature, complex choice young readers might not fully process but adults understand. Viscerally giving up being loved to keep someone safe, making yourself orphaned to protect your parents. Hermione's sacrifice parallels Harry's walk to his death, but receives far less attention. Perhaps because it's quieter, more personal, doesn't involve dramatic confrontation with Voldemort, but it's no less complete as sacrifice, no less painful as loss, no less brave as choice. Bellatrix Lestrange's torture of Hermione at Malfoy Manor represents gendered violence that the narrative handles with appropriate gravity while avoiding graphic detail. Bellatrix carves the word mudblood into Hermione's arm with a cursed knife, leaving permanent scarring, while interrogating her about the Sword of Gryffindor. The scene is harrowing. Harry and Ron forced to listen from the cellar below, helpless to stop Hermione's screams, driven nearly mad by inability to protect her. Adult readers, particularly women, recognize the specific horror of this scene. The way Bellatrix's feminine cruelty toward another young woman carries undertones of sadistic pleasure. The way physical marking and violation are used as tools of power and degradation. The scar Hermione carries afterward is permanent, visible reminder of trauma she endured. And the books acknowledge this. Appropriately, she's shaken, frightened, requires time to recover. What makes this scene particularly effective from a mature storytelling perspective is what it doesn't show. The way Rowling conveys the horror through Harry's perspective, listening below rather than graphic description, letting readers' imagination fill in details while maintaining focus on emotional impact rather than violence itself. The rescue by Dobby, who dies in the process of saving them, links sacrifice and trauma inextricably. Hermione carries both the scar and the guilt of Dobby's death. Multiple layers of trauma from single incident that adult readers recognize as realistic complexity rather than neat resolution. The Battle of Hogwarts sees the deaths of Fred Weasley, Remus Lupin, Nymphadora Tonks, Colin Creevey, and 50 others in single night, representing catastrophic loss that the narrative doesn't fully have space to process. Fred dies in explosion during the fighting, killed midlife while battling alongside Percy, the brother he'd just reconciled with after years of estrangement. The Weasley family's grief, particularly George, who loses his twin. His other half gets brief acknowledgement, but there's no time to properly mourn because the battle continues. Lupin and Tonks die, leaving their infant son orphaned, repeating the cycle that orphaned Harry, creating another child who will grow up without parents because of Voldemort's war. Colin Creevey, only 16, sneaks back to fight despite being underage and is killed, his tiny body carried from battle by Oliver Wood. Adult readers recognize these losses as realistic costs of war, not just heroes dying dramatically, but ordinary people, young people, parents and siblings and friends, all torn away in chaos of combat. The battle's aftermath, with bodies laid in Great Hall for identification, families searching for loved ones, survivors treating wounded while processing who didn't survive. This reads like actual war coverage, like scenes from refugee camps or field hospitals, bringing home the cost in ways that feel genuine rather than sanitized. Harry's grief has to wait because he still has to die, still has to face Voldemort one final time, carrying the weight of all these deaths on his way to his own. Harry's decision to walk into the Forbidden Forest to die represents the series' ultimate meditation on sacrifice and the acceptance of mortality. He's just learned from Snape's memories that he contains a piece of Voldemort's soul, that he's been a Horcrux all along, that Dumbledore raised him knowing he'd have to die for Voldemort to be truly defeated. This revelation could break someone, but Harry accepts it with remarkable grace, understanding that his death can save everyone else, that his life has value precisely in its sacrifice. The walk through the forest, using the resurrection stone to summon shades of his parents, Sirius and Lupin, provides comfort while emphasizing the loneliness of his choice. They can accompany him, but cannot take his place. When he drops the stone before reaching Voldemort, deliberately losing it rather than clinging to the dead, he demonstrates mature wisdom about grief and acceptance. He doesn't ask Voldemort for mercy, doesn't beg, doesn't fight, just stands there and accepts the killing curse. For adult readers, particularly those who have contemplated mortality or faced terminal diagnosis, this scene carries profound weight. The courage required to walk toward death with open eyes, to choose ending for the sake of others, to accept that this is how your story concludes. The King's Cross limbo scene that follows, Harry's conversation with Dumbledore in that strange white space, explores what might come after death, with remarkable thoughtfulness for young adult literature. Harry's choice to return, to board the train, represents not resurrection exactly, but something more complex, choosing life after accepting death, finding courage to continue after you've made peace with ending. Narcissa, Malfoy's lie to Voldemort, represents maternal love, overriding ideology. Small act of defiance that proves crucial to Voldemort's defeat. When she's sent to check if Harry is dead in the forest, she whispers to ask if Draco is alive in the castle, and when Harry confirms he is, she lies to Voldemort, declares Harry dead even though she can feel his heartbeat. This isn't heroism in the traditional sense. Narcissa hasn't switched sides, hasn't denounced pure blood ideology, hasn't had moral awakening about Death Eater's evil. She simply wants to get inside the castle to find her son, and helping Harry achieve that. Yet this purely selfish motivation saves everyone, because Voldemort believes her and returns to Hogwarts convinced Harry is dead, walking into the final confrontation unprepared for what's actually coming. Adult readers appreciate this moral complexity. You don't have to be good to do the right thing. Don't have to renounce all your beliefs to make one crucial choice that matters. Narcissa's love for Draco, her willingness to risk everything for his safety, mirrors Lily's sacrifice for Harry, demonstrating that maternal love transcends ideology, even when nothing else does. The Malfoy family fleeing the battle together rather than fighting for either side, choosing survival and each other over Voldemort's cause, represents practical rather than moral desertion, but it's desertion nonetheless, more evidence that ideology crumbles when confronted with genuine human attachment. The epilogue, set 19 years later, provides closure while raising questions adult readers can't help but notice. Harry and Ginny, Ron and Hermione, married with children, sending their own kids to Hogwarts, represents happy ending after all the trauma and loss. Yet adult readers might wonder how these deeply traumatized people, Harry with his PTSD, Hermione with her torture scars, Ron with his survivor's guilt, all of them with countless friends, dead, managed to build functional families and apparently normal lives. The epilogue glosses over therapy, recovery, grief work, all the actual processing that would be required to move from child soldier to functional parent. It's perhaps overly optimistic in its neatness, everyone paired off in expected combinations, children named after the dead, in ways that seem sweet but might also represent inability to move past loss. Naming your children after dead parents and dead mentors and dead friends keeps the past always present, ensures you're speaking names of trauma victims every day. The fact that Slytherin House apparently still exists unchanged, that the magical world's structural problems seem unaddressed, that nothing fundamental has changed, except Voldemort's defeated adult readers notice these gaps. There's no mention of house self-liberation, no suggestion that blood purity ideology has been dismantled rather than just defeated militarily, no indication that the ministry has reformed into something more just. The epilogue provides emotional closure, reassurance that our heroes survived and found happiness, but it sidesteps the harder questions about systemic change and generational trauma that adult readers might want addressed. The Resurrection Stone's temptation reveals truths about grief and the danger of refusing to let the dead rest. The stone is one of 3 deathly hallows, capable of summoning shades of the deceased, and everyone who uses it suffers for it. Cadmus Peverell, who first owned it, brought back his dead fiancée, but found her cold and distant, a shadow rather than the woman he loved, and eventually killed himself to truly join her. When Harry uses it in the forest, before facing Voldemort, the shades of his parents and loved ones provide comfort, but cannot truly return their echoes. Memories made visible, not genuine resurrection. The stone represents the human impulse to cling to the dead, to refuse acceptance of loss, and Rowling treats this impulse with appropriate gravity. Dumbledore wanted the stone not for power, but because he desperately wanted to see his dead family again, wanted to apologize to his sister, wanted relief from guilt that had haunted him for a century. This desire nearly destroyed him when he put on the ring that contained the stone, forgetting it was also a Horcrux, demonstrating how grief can make even the wisest people reckless. Adult readers who have experienced significant loss recognize the stone's temptation, who wouldn't want one more conversation with someone gone, one more chance to say things left unsaid, one more moment of contact. Yet the stone offers only shadow, not substance, showing that healthy grief requires letting go rather than grasping at echoes. Harry's decision to drop the stone in the forest, to deliberately lose it rather than keeping it, to speak with his parents whenever he wants, represents mature acceptance that the dead should remain dead, that love means letting them rest rather than calling them back for your own comfort. Kreacher's transformation from hostile to loyal house elf demonstrates how cruelty begets cruelty, while kindness can break cycles of hatred, even in those thoroughly indoctrinated. Kreacher served the Black family for generations, absorbing their pure-blood ideology, particularly devoted to Regulus Black, who treated him with some measure of respect. When Sirius inherits him, Kreacher is bitter and resentful, muttering insults, following orders with malicious compliance, eventually betraying Sirius to Bellatrix and contributing to Sirius's death. Harry initially hates Kreacher for this betrayal, but when he learns Kreacher's full story, how Voldemort used him to test the defenses around a Horcrux, left him to die on the island, how Regulus ordered him to survive, and later sacrificed himself trying to destroy that Horcrux, Harry's perspective shifts. When Harry treats Kreacher with kindness, gives him Regulus's locket as promised, speaks to him with respect, Kreacher's entire demeanor changes. He becomes helpful, even affectionate, leading house elves into battle against Death Eaters, while calling for vengeance for Regulus. Adult readers recognize this pattern. Abused individuals often perpetuate abuse until someone breaks the cycle with genuine care. How even those who seem irredeemable can change when treated with dignity. Kreacher's arc doesn't erase his complicity in Sirius's death, doesn't make everything neat and forgiven, but it demonstrates that change is possible when someone chooses empathy over continued punishment. Its small-scale version of larger theme about breaking generational cycles of hatred. Molly Weasley's confrontation with Bellatrix Lestrange over Ginny's life represents maternal fury unleashed, one of the few moments where a mother's protective rage becomes literal combat magic. When Bellatrix targets Ginny during the final battle, Molly steps in with a ferocity that surprises everyone, including herself. Her famous line, "Not my daughter, you bitch," represents complete abandonment of her usual kindness in favor of primal protective instinct. She duels Bellatrix to death, not capture, not disarmament, but actual killing, demonstrating that even gentle people become capable of lethal violence when their children are threatened. Adult readers, particularly parents, recognize this transformation, understand how protective instinct can override every other consideration, including personal safety and moral restraint. Molly has already lost Fred that same night, already absorbed that unbearable grief, and the thought of losing Ginny too unleashes something fierce and unstoppable. The duel itself is brief but brutal, showing that Molly's years of household magic and raising 7 children haven't diminished her combat abilities, just redirected them toward domestic life. Her victory over Bellatrix, one of Voldemort's most skilled Death Eaters, demonstrates that underestimating mothers is a fatal mistake. The scene also provides catharsis after all the losses of the battle, giving readers someone to hate in Bellatrix and someone to cheer in Molly. Moral clarity in moment when everything else is chaos and grief. The broader wizarding world's response to Voldemort's return reveals how societies choose collaboration or resistance when fascism arrives. Most wizards simply try to survive, keeping heads down, not joining Death Eaters, but not actively resisting either. Some, like Xenophilius Lovegood, try to maintain independence until personal threat forces compromise. He betrays Harry's location to save Luna, choosing family over principles when Death Eaters make the cost of resistance unbearable. Others actively collaborate, like those who staff the Muggleborn Registration Commission or enforce discriminatory laws, becoming willing participants in oppression. The Order of the Phoenix represents active resistance, but their small group against massive institutional power. Adult readers recognize these patterns from historical occupations and dictatorships: the majority who try to wait it out, the minority who collaborate for safety or advantage, the even smaller minority who actively resist at great personal risk. There's no judgment-free zone. Even trying to stay neutral constitutes choice with moral weight. The series doesn't pretend this is simple or that everyone has equal capacity for heroism. Some people have more to lose. Lovegood has Luna. The Malfoys have each other. Families with children face different calculus than single adults. But the narrative still holds people accountable for their choices, while acknowledging the impossible situations those choices emerge from. This moral complexity, this refusal to pretend resistance is easy, or that everyone who doesn't resist is equally culpable, marks the series as genuinely thoughtful about how fascism actually functions. Hagrid's grief over creatures and his willingness to defend them, even when they're dangerous, reveals different kind of love, one that extends beyond human relationships to encompass all living things regardless of their monstrousness. Hagrid loves Aragog the giant spider, Buckbeak the hippogriff, Norbert the dragon, his 3-headed dog Fluffy, even though all of them are capable of killing him and have killed others. His brother Grop, a violent giant who initially wants nothing to do with Hagrid, receives patient teaching and affection until relationship develops. Hagrid's tears over creatures most wizards would gladly see dead demonstrate that love isn't reserved for the safe or convenient or conventionally worthy. When Aragog dies, Hagrid mourns genuinely, despite the spider having bred colonies that threaten students. When Buckbeak is sentenced to execution for attacking Draco, Hagrid's grief is profound, even though Buckbeak is an inherently dangerous animal. Adult readers recognize in Hagrid someone who loves without limit or discrimination, who sees worth in creatures others dismiss as monsters, who grieves for things the rest of society considers disposable. This can read as foolish. His love nearly gets people killed multiple times, but it also represents radical acceptance, refusal to categorize some lives as worthless. Hagrid's care for dangerous creatures mirrors the series' larger theme about seeing humanity in unexpected places, about how even those society labels as monsters deserve consideration and kindness. His tears are always genuine, his heart always open, even when his judgment is questionable. The three Deathly Hallows together represent three approaches to death: the Elder Wand, for those who fight death through power; the Resurrection Stone, for those who deny death through memory; and the Invisibility Cloak, for those who accept death but don't rush to meet it. The fairy tale of the three Peverell brothers teaches that trying to conquer death through any means leads to tragedy. The first brother, with his unbeatable wand, becomes so arrogant about his power that he's killed in his sleep. The second brother, with his stone to summon the dead, goes mad from grief and joins them. Only the third brother, with his cloak to hide from death until he's ready, lives long, full life and greets death as old friend when time comes. Harry's journey involves collecting all three Hallows but learning to use them appropriately. The wand he wins but doesn't keep, planning to let its power die with him. The stone he uses briefly, then drops in the forest. The cloak he treasures because it represents his father's love and practical protection without illusions about cheating mortality. Adult readers recognize this as wisdom literature dressed as fantasy, teaching genuine lesson about mortality that resonates across traditions. You cannot defeat death, cannot bring back the dead, cannot bring back the dead, cannot make yourself invincible, but you can live fully and meet death with acceptance when it comes. Voldemort's mistake was pursuing immortality at all costs, fragmenting his soul, destroying his humanity in futile attempt to avoid what all living things face. Harry's wisdom is accepting death as inevitable, even walking toward it when necessary, which paradoxically allows him to survive in return. The Sorting Hat's insistence that Harry could have thrived in Slytherin raises uncomfortable questions about nature versus choice, about how thin the line is between hero and villain when they share ambition and cunning. Harry possesses many Slytherin traits. He's resourceful, clever, willing to break rules, capable of lying when necessary, ambitious in his own way. The piece of Voldemort's soul inside him reinforces these qualities, giving him Parseltang and connection to Dark Lord's thoughts. What separates Harry from Voldemort isn't that Harry lacks dark potential, but that he makes different choices, values different things, loves where Voldemort cannot. The Sorting Hat wanted to place him in Slytherin based on his qualities, and only his desperate plea, not Slytherin, led to Gryffindor placement. This suggests that house placement, identity, even moral character depend heavily on choice rather than inherent nature. Adult readers appreciate this moral sophistication. The hero isn't simply born good but chooses good repeatedly, despite possessing capacity for darkness. The series dismantles simplistic notions of good and evil houses, good and evil people, in favor of more complex understanding where everyone possesses mixed potential, and our choices define us more than our traits. This becomes explicit in Harry's conversation with his son Albus in the epilogue, reassuring him that Slytherin wouldn't be shameful because Slytherin produced Snape, who was the bravest man I ever knew. The rehabilitation of Slytherin House, the acknowledgement that it doesn't determine destiny, represents mature understanding that institutions and groups contain multitudes, that labels don't define worth. Ginny Weasley's recovery from being possessed by Tom Riddle's diary during her first year demonstrates resilience, but also carries trauma that's never fully explored. At 11 years old, she was manipulated and controlled by a fragment of Voldemort's soul, forced to open the Chamber of Secrets, set a basilisk on students, write threatening messages in blood, nearly died in the chamber as her life drained into Riddle's memory. Harry saves her, but the psychological aftermath of months of possession, of having your will completely subjugated, of nearly dying as your life force feeds a dead boy's memory, this would devastate most people. Yet Ginny receives no apparent counseling or long-term support, just returns to school the next year, and is expected to be fine. Adult readers, particularly those aware of trauma's long-term impacts, might wonder how an 11-year-old processes this experience and emerges as confident, capable teenager. The books show Ginny's strengths. She becomes formidable witch, skilled duelist, brave member of Dumbledore's army, Harry's eventual partner, but they don't examine the cost of what she endured or how she healed from it. Her later relationship with Harry gains complexity when you remember she understands possession, knows what it's like to have something dark living inside you, making her one of few people who can comprehend Harry's connection to Voldemort. Their shared experience with Tom Riddle creates bond beyond typical romance, connection forged through parallel trauma and survival. Through a wolf registry and discriminatory legislation against werewolves represents systematic marginalization codified into law, demonstrating how prejudice becomes institutionalized. Werewolves face legal barriers to employment, must register with ministry, are tracked and monitored, face social ostracism based entirely on condition they didn't choose and can't control. Dolores Umbridge authors much of this anti-werewolf legislation, her bureaucratic hatred toward those she considers half-breeds revealing how ordinary prejudice becomes policy when bigots gain power. Fenrir Greyback, the werewolf who embraces his monster status and deliberately infects children, becomes both symptom and justification for this discrimination. He's what prejudiced wizards claim all werewolves are, yet his monstrousness arguably stems from society's treatment as much as his nature. When you're told you're a monster from childhood, when every door closes because of what you are, when you're denied dignity and opportunity and basic rights, some people internalize that designation and become what they're accused of being. This doesn't excuse Greyback's horrific choices, but it contextualizes them within a system that created conditions for such hatred to flourish. Lupin represents the alternative werewolf who fights his nature, tries to live ethically, suffers under discriminatory laws while maintaining his humanity. Yet even Lupin's goodness doesn't protect him from prejudice, doesn't change unjust laws, doesn't prevent his poverty and marginalization. Adult readers recognize this pattern from real-world discrimination, creating underclass through legislation, pointing to worst examples to justify continued oppression, ignoring counterexamples that demonstrate prejudices, falseness, the unforgivable curses, and Harry's eventual use of them demonstrates moral compromise that war necessitates, how even heroes with strong principles cross lines they once considered absolute. Imperio, Cruciatus, and Avada Kedavra are deemed unforgivable. By wizarding law their use earns life sentence in Azkaban. Yet, by the final book, Harry uses Imperio multiple times to break into Gringotts, uses Cruciatus on Amicus Caro for spitting on McGonagall, attempts it on Bellatrix after Sirius's death. The books don't condemn him for this, don't treat it as moral failing requiring redemption, but rather as grim necessity of warfare, where clean hands become luxury no one can afford. Adult readers recognize this moral realism that prolonged conflict erodes absolute principles, that protecting others sometimes requires using the enemy's weapons, that survival can demand compromising values you thought inviolable. The fact that Harry never uses Avada Kedavra, never actually kills with magic despite everything, preserves his essential goodness while acknowledging he's been forced to bend in other ways. The series walks a difficult line here, showing war's moral corruption without excusing atrocity, demonstrating how good people make compromising choices under extreme duress while maintaining there are still some lines like murder curse that shouldn't be crossed. This nuance marks mature storytelling willing to explore genuinely difficult ethical territory. The Weasley family's poverty represents class struggle that persists even in magical world, showing that inequality isn't solved by wands and spells. The Weasleys are pure-blood family, magically talented, morally upright, yet constantly struggling financially. Their children wear hand-me-down robes, use second-hand books, face mockery from wealthier students like Malfoy, who sneer at their worn possessions. Arthur works dead-end job at ministry. Molly manages household without employment. They stretch every galleon to cover 7 children's educations. Their burrow is warm and loving, but cramped and shabby, held together with magic and determination. Adult readers recognize the Weasleys as working-class family, doing their best in a system that doesn't reward virtue or hard work with financial security. The contrast with the Malfoys' wealthy, influential, able to buy their way into power demonstrates that magical world replicates Muggle class hierarchies despite claims of being different society. Blood status and wealth often align, with old pure-blood families possessing generational wealth, while Muggleborns and blood traitors struggle economically. The Weasleys' goodness doesn't lift them from poverty. Their righteousness doesn't earn them respect from those who value gold over character. This represents a realistic depiction of how class systems function. Virtue doesn't guarantee success. Loving family doesn't pay bills, and economic struggle affects even those doing everything right. Mrs. Weasley's boggart, revealing her deepest fear, seeing each family member dead, in turn demonstrates the specific terror of maternal love during wartime. When she encounters the boggart at Grimmauld Place, it cycles through images of her worst nightmare: Ron dead, Fred and George dead, Harry dead, all her children and husband corpses that she's helpless to prevent. Molly breaks down completely, unable to banish the boggart, because the fear is too overwhelming, too real, too grounded in actual danger her family faces. For mothers reading this scene, particularly those who have children in dangerous situations or have lived through conflict, Molly's terror resonates viscerally. She's not warrior or fighter by nature. She's mother trying to keep family safe in a world that wants to kill them, watching her children join war effort, knowing any of them might not return. Her fear proves prophetic when Fred dies in the battle, her worst nightmare becoming reality, despite everything she did to prevent it. Adult readers recognize Molly's boggart, seen as one of series' most emotionally devastating moments, precisely because it's so human, so specific to parental love, so grounded in realistic fear rather than abstract danger. The fact that Lupin has to physically remove the boggart because Molly cannot function in face of her fear demonstrates that some terrors are too great to simply magic away, that love creates vulnerability even the bravest cannot overcome. Dumbledore's portrait in the headmaster's office represents complicated legacy and the question of how we remember flawed leaders. The portrait can advise, converse, share knowledge, but it's not truly Dumbledore. It's magical echo, programmed with his memories and personality, doing what it thinks Dumbledore would do. Harry consults the portrait after the war, seeking guidance from man who manipulated him throughout his life while simultaneously protecting him. The portrait cannot truly grow or change or admit mistakes in the way living Dumbledore eventually did. It's frozen in whatever understanding Dumbledore possessed at death. Adult readers might question the ethics of creating these eternal advisors, of preserving leaders' influence beyond their natural lives, of never allowing new generation to fully escape previous generations' shadow. The portrait represents how institutions memorialize powerful figures, creating permanent legacy that can guide or constrain those who follow. It simultaneously comfort wisdom and experience preserved and burden-eyed ability to move beyond past, to make decisions without consulting those who are dead. The magical world's practice of portrait magic raises questions about when we should listen to the dead and when we should forge our own paths, about how much influence previous generations should maintain over current problems they didn't fully understand. The Room of Requirements' destruction by Funfire during the final battle represents collateral damage in war. How beautiful and useful things are consumed in conflicts, chaos. The room had served students for centuries, adapting to their needs, providing sanctuary and tools and space for learning. Dumbledore's army trained there. Harry hid the Half-Blood Prince's book there. Generations of students found what they needed in that magical space. Then Crabbe, trying to kill Harry and his friends, conjures fire-cursed flame that destroys everything, even magical protections, and loses control. The fire consumes the room entirely, destroying countless magical artifacts, reducing the space itself to ruin, killing Crabbe in the inferno he created. The room's loss represents all the incidental destruction that warfare brings: libraries burned, historical sites destroyed, cultural heritage erased, not because anyone intended it, but because conflict consumes everything in its path. Adult readers recognize this pattern from real-world wars where ancient cities crumble, museums are looted, irreplaceable knowledge vanishes simply because it existed in wrong place during combat. The fact that Crabbe dies in the fire he created demonstrates that destructive power turns on those who wield it carelessly, that weapons meant to kill enemies often destroy their users, that escalation leads to chaos no one can control. Harry saving Draco and Goyle from the flames, even after they tried to kill him, represents choosing life over revenge even in moment of extreme danger, maintaining humanity when everything around you burns. Voldemort's fear of death stems from never having lived fully, never experiencing connections that make mortality bearable. He split his soul repeatedly to achieve immortality, But in fragmenting himself, he destroyed what makes life worth living: capacity for love, genuine relationships, emotional wholeness. By the time he returns to corporeal form, he's barely human, snake-like and monstrous, held together by dark magic and desperate fear. His inability to understand love as power, his dismissal of sacrifice as weakness, his conviction that only the strong survive these reveals someone who has never experienced what he's rejecting. Voldemort never had parents who loved him, never had friends who knew him truly, never allowed himself vulnerability or genuine connection. His immortality, achieved at cost of his humanity, becomes living death, existence without meaning beyond continued existence. Adult readers recognize this as profound emptiness, life reduced to mere survival, without purpose or joy. The final confrontation reveals Voldemort's ultimate failure. He cannot understand why his killing curse rebounds, cannot comprehend how love and sacrifice work, literally lacks the emotional framework to grasp his own defeat. His death is almost anticlimactic, body falling ordinary and mortal, revealing that his supposed immortality was always illusion. The question the series poses through Voldemort is whether existence without love, without human connection, without capacity for genuine feeling, constitutes living at all, or whether he was already dead long before the final curse. Winky the house elf's alcoholism and depression, after being freed, demonstrates that liberation, without support or preparation, can be destructive, complicating simple narratives about freedom always being preferable to bondage. Winky loved serving the Crouch family, found identity and purpose in her service, and when Barty, Crouch Sr., frees her in disgrace, she falls apart completely. She takes to drinking butterbeer constantly, becoming first alcoholic house elf we encounter, sobbing about her disgrace, unable to function without the structure bondage provided. Adult readers recognize this as realistic portrayal of how oppressed populations struggle when suddenly freed without resources, education, or mental preparation for independence. Centuries of enslavement created house elf culture, where servitude feels natural, where freedom feels like exile and punishment. Winky's suffering doesn't justify slavery, but it complicates easy answers about liberation, showing that freedom requires more than just removing chains. It requires building capacity for autonomy, providing support during transition, addressing psychological damage that bondage inflicted. Hermione's SPEW activism fails partly because it doesn't account for this complexity, assuming all house elves want freedom when many fear it. Having internalized their oppression so thoroughly, they cannot imagine alternative. The series raises these questions without fully resolving them, leaving readers to grapple with how societies dismantle oppression when the oppressed have been conditioned to accept or even defend their subjugation. Minerva McGonagall's quiet strength throughout the series represents leadership without showmanship, competence without need for recognition, competence that manifests in daily dedication rather than dramatic gestures. She runs Hogwarts practically single-handedly during Dumbledore's frequent absences, maintains order during crisis after crisis, protects students fiercely while enforcing rules fairly. When Umbridge takes over the school, McGonagall resists within the system, finding ways to subvert authority while maintaining her position to protect students from worse harm. She takes 4 stunners to the chest, defending Hagrid, and nearly dies, but returns to work without fanfare. During the final battle, she animates the castle's suits of armor with visible joy. I've always wanted to use that spell, revealing playfulness hidden beneath stern exterior. Adult readers, particularly those in teaching or leadership roles, recognize McGonagall as embodiment of professional excellence, someone who does difficult work year after year without requiring praise or appreciation, whose dedication stems from genuine care rather than ego. Her grief over Dumbledore's death, her fierce protection of Harry, her willingness to duel Snape when she believes he's betrayed the school, these moments reveal depths of feeling she normally keeps controlled. She represents generation that endured first war against Voldemort, lost friends and colleagues, then had to fight again when he returned, carrying that history silently while preparing new generation for battles she hoped they'd never face. Petunia Dursley's relationship with magic reveals how jealousy and exclusion can curdle into lifelong bitterness, how being the ordinary sibling to someone extraordinary shapes identity in destructive ways. Petunia desperately wanted to attend Hogwarts as a child, wrote to Dumbledore, begging for admission despite being received gentle rejection explaining she couldn't attend because she lacked magic. Her sister Lily got everything Petunia wanted: special abilities, magical worlds, wonders, escape from ordinary suburban life. That childhood wound never healed, festering into resentment that poisoned Petunia's entire adult life. She married Vernon specifically because he was aggressively normal, created household that rejected anything unusual, taught Dudley to despise Harry because Harry represented everything magical that Petunia was denied. Her treatment of Harry the cupboard, the neglect, the constant reminders that his unwanted stems from seeing Lily in him, being confronted daily with her sister's legacy and her own exclusion. The howler she receives in Order of the Phoenix, reminding her, "Remember my last Petunia," refers to Dumbledore's letter explaining the blood protection, suggesting she once possessed enough humanity to accept Harry, despite her bitterness. Adult readers, particularly those with sibling relationships complicated by inequality or favoritism, recognize Petunia's psychology, how childhood wounds metastasize, how feeling less than can define entire life, how jealousy transforms love into cruelty. She's not sympathetic exactly, but she's understandable, human in her smallness and pain. The Triwizard Tournament's deadly design represents institutional recklessness disguised as tradition. How dangerous practices persist because we've always done it this way, even when death is likely outcome. The tournament was discontinued for centuries because too many champions died, then reinstated because the danger is part of the appeal. Spectacle valued over safety. 14-year-old Harry is forced to compete despite being underage, bound by magical contract he didn't agree to, facing tasks designed to potentially kill 17-year-olds with 3 more years of training. The first task involves stealing eggs from nesting dragons, creatures that kill trained handlers regularly. The second requires breathing underwater for an hour while fighting aggressive merpeople. The third is a maze filled with deadly creatures and dark magic. These aren't tests of skill, but survival challenges, where death is accepted possibility. Cedric's actual death during the third task, when the cup becomes a portkey to Voldemort, almost overshadows how easily death could have occurred during the official tasks themselves. Adult readers recognize this as institutional failure, adults organizing death trap competition for teenagers, spectators cheering as children risk their lives, all under veneer of magical tradition and inter-school cooperation. The tournament represents how institutions prioritize spectacle and tradition over human safety, how normalized danger becomes when wrapped in ceremony and prestige, how easily society accepts risk to young lives when entertainment or glory is at stake. Barty Crouch Jr.'s imprisonment by his own father represents family destroyed by zealotry and inability to reconcile ideology with love. Crouch Sr. was fanatical about catching Death Eaters, authorized use of unforgivable curses against them, sent countless people to Azkaban, including his own son. When Barty Jr. was convicted rightly of torturing the Longbottoms, his father could have shown mercy, but instead sent him to Azkaban as public demonstration that not even family would spare. Death Eaters from justice. Later, dying mother's final wish convinced Crouch Sr. to break his son out, but instead of genuine rehabilitation or reconciliation, he kept Barty Jr. imprisoned at home under invisibility cloak, controlled by imperious curse, essentially trading one prison for another. This wasn't rescued but different form of incarceration. Son kept alive but not free, hidden away as shameful secret. The relationship was so poisoned that when Barty Jr. eventually broke free and engineered his father's death, there was no hesitation, no filial affection remaining, just hatred for the man who imprisoned him twice. Adult readers recognize this tragedy of competing duties. Crouch Sr.'s obligation to justice versus obligation to family, his inability to reconcile being father with being judge, ultimately failing at both. His fate, murdered by his son, body transfigured and buried, disappearing without anyone noticing or caring, represents complete failure of legacy. Everything he built collapsing into nothing. The Crouch family's destruction demonstrates how zealotry, even in service of fighting evil, can become its own form of evil when it erases capacity for mercy or love. The use of Veritaserum during interrogations raises disturbing questions about truth, consent, and magical violation of mental autonomy. Veritaserum forces truthful answers, removing ability to lie or withhold information. Essentially magical torture that leaves no physical marks. The Ministry uses it during trials and interrogations, and while it seems like an efficient way to determine guilt or innocence, it represents profound violation. Your thoughts, your secrets, your private knowledge forcibly extracted against your will. The fact that it's treated as acceptable, even routine procedure, demonstrates casual acceptance of mental invasion in magical justice system. Adult readers recognize parallels to truth serums, enhanced interrogation, any method that removes consent from the interrogated. The potion's limitations, it can be resisted by skilled ectomans, can be counteracted by antidotes, doesn't account for false memories or delusions, mean it's not even reliable, yet it's still used as though it guarantees truth. When Umbridge tries to use it on Harry, we're meant to be horrified, yet the ministry she represents uses the same potion on others routinely. This moral inconsistency, wrong when used on heroes, acceptable when used on suspects, reveals how easily societies justify violations when aimed at acceptable targets. The series doesn't interrogate this deeply enough, treating Veritaserum as a neutral tool rather than examining the ethics of forced truth-telling. But adult readers notice the implications. Neville's grandmother's expectations and her disappointment in Neville's early struggles represent generational pressure and the burden of living up to legendary parents. Augusta Longbottom is fierce, demanding, uncompromising, constantly comparing Neville to his parents, who were heroic auras tortured into insanity, defending against Death Eaters. She gives Neville his father's wand, forcing him to use someone else's wand that doesn't choose him, literally handicapping his magic because she wants him to live up to his father's legacy. She dresses him in his father's clothes, sends howlers when he disappoints, makes clear that he's failing to meet expectations constantly. For years, Neville believes himself nearly squib, incompetent at magic, disappointing everyone, when actually he's talented wizard using wrong wand and crushed under impossible expectations. When he finally gets his own wand and begins to flourish, when he leads resistance at Hogwarts and destroys the final Horcrux, Augusta's pride suggests she never recognized how her pressure contributed to his struggles. Adult readers, particularly those who have dealt with demanding parents or felt inadequate compared to siblings, recognize this dynamic, how family expectations can be as destructive as they are motivating, how constantly measuring child against idealized version of what they should be prevents them from becoming who they are. Neville's eventual heroism happens despite his upbringing, not because of it, suggesting that sometimes the greatest act of courage is becoming yourself rather than the person others expect you to be. The Marauders' treatment of Severus Snape during their school years reveals that Harry's father and godfather were bullies, complicating the idealized image Harry carries of parents he never knew. The pensive memory Harry witnesses shows James and Sirius publicly humiliating Snape's, tripping him, mocking him, threatening to remove his underwear, while Lupin watches without intervening and Peter cheers them on. This isn't playful rivalry but genuine cruelty, popular students targeting unpopular one for entertainment, using magical superiority to humiliate someone who couldn't defend himself against 4 attackers. The memory devastates Harry because he's built his identity partly on being James Potter's son, on believing his father was hero, and discovering James was also teenage bully who abused his power complicates that narrative painfully. Adult readers recognize this moral complexity. Good people can do bad things. Heroes in one context can be villains in another. The father who died protecting his family was also the teenager who tormented vulnerable classmate for years. Sirius's dismissal of their bullying, he never lost an opportunity to curse James, sounds like excuse bullies always make, blaming victim for retaliating against sustained abuse. Lupin's admission that he should have stopped James but didn't because he was grateful for their friendship reveals moral cowardice of bystander. The Marauders' treatment of Snape doesn't excuse Snape's later choices to join Death Eaters, but it provides context, shows how cruelty experienced can feed cruelty enacted, how the bullied often become bullies when given power over others. The Dementor's kiss represents punishment worse than death, soul extraction that leaves body alive but person gone, raising profound questions about capital punishment and what constitutes humane justice. The kiss is ministry-sanctioned penalty for worst criminals, considered more merciful than execution because the body survives, but it's arguably more cruel, removing everything that makes someone human while leaving empty shell to exist indefinitely. Barty Crouch Jr. receives the kiss before he can testify about Voldemort's return, conveniently silencing him when his testimony would have forced ministry to acknowledge truth they wanted to deny. This demonstrates how extreme punishment serves political purposes, how eliminating someone's ability to speak can be disguised as justice. Adult readers recognize disturbing parallels to lobotomy, to vegetative states, to any punishment that destroys personhood while preserving biological life. The wizarding world treats the kiss as acceptable despite its horror, another example of casual cruelty normalized within magical justice system. The fact that Dementors themselves are deployed as prison guards, creatures that feed on happiness and force prisoners to relive worst memories, shows systematic use of psychological torture. Azkaban isn't rehabilitation, it's punishment designed to break people. The series presents this critically through Sirius's experience, but doesn't imagine alternatives even after the war. Presumably, Azkaban continues operating, Dementors remain employed, the kiss remains available as punishment. Adult readers might wonder why victorious heroes don't reform this obviously cruel system. Luna Lovegood's social isolation and the bullying she endures reveal how cruelty operates when targeting eccentric individuals who don't conform to social norms. Luna believes in creatures others dismiss as nonsense, makes statements that seem disconnected from reality, wears unusual accessories, behaves in ways that mark her as strange. Her classmates steal her possessions, hide her shoes, mock her openly, call her Loony Lovegood, as though her oddness justifies their cruelty. Yet Luna maintains her essential self without hardening into bitterness, continues believing what she believes, treats everyone with kindness despite receiving mockery in return. Her ability to form genuine friendship with Harry, to offer insight when others can't, to fight bravely in Department of Mysteries and later battles, demonstrates that difference isn't deficit, that those who seem odd often possess wisdom conventional people miss. Adult readers, particularly those who are bullied for being different or who have neurodivergent children, recognize Luna as representation of how society treats those who don't conform with suspicion. Mockery, casual cruelty, disguised as teasing. The revelation that Luna watched her mother die in magical experiment gone wrong adds tragic dimension to her dreamy detachment, suggesting that her unusual affect might be coping mechanism for profound grief, way of staying connected to mother who was also experimental and unconventional. Luna's acceptance of things others can't, Sithestrals, Raxprets, Naggles represents willingness to believe in what evidence doesn't prove, maintaining wonder in world that demands cynical certainty. The portrait of Sirius's mother at Grimmauld Place, permanently stuck to the wall and screaming abuse at everyone who enters, represents toxic family legacy that cannot be removed, only managed. The portrait shrieks about blood traitors, mudbloods, filth in her house, continuing the Black family's pureblood ideology long after actual Mrs. Black died. Sirius cannot remove it, despite it being his house, cannot silence it except temporarily, forced to live with manifestation of his mother's hatred and rejection. The portrait represents how family dysfunction persists across generations, how parental abuse continues affecting adult children long after the parent is gone, how internalized voices of criticism and hatred cannot simply be torn down or dismissed. Adult readers who have dealt with toxic family members, particularly those who have inherited family homes loaded with painful memories, recognize this symbolism. The portrait isn't just magical inconvenience, it's literal haunting by abuse survived, reminder of what Sirius escaped but can never fully leave behind. His decision to stay at Grimmauld Place despite the portrait, to use his hated childhood home as Order headquarters, represents attempt to reclaim space that traumatized him, to make something good from inheritance of pain. His death before he can fully succeed at this reclamation adds to the tragedy. He never gets to truly exorcise his mother's ghost, never gets to make peace with the past that shaped him. The Ministry's rapid collapse when Voldemort attacks demonstrates how quickly institutions fail when built on corruption rather than principles, when more concerned with maintaining power than serving people. Throughout Order of the Phoenix, the Ministry prioritizes Fudge's reputation over public safety, uses propaganda to discredit truth, persecutes those who warn of danger. This systematic corruption means that when Voldemort finally attacks the Ministry directly, when he appears in the atrium fighting Dumbledore, the institution is already hollow, already compromised, ready to crumble. Scrimgeour tries to maintain facade of strength, but the Ministry has lost public trust, lost moral authority, lost the credibility needed to lead during crisis. When Death Eaters finally infiltrate through Imperious curse and intimidation, the Ministry falls almost without fight, because there's nothing substantial left to defend just self-interested bureaucrats protecting careers, not principled leaders protecting society. Adult readers who have watched institutional failures, governments bungling crises, corporations prioritizing profit over people, systems collapsing under their own corruption, recognize this pattern. The Ministry's failure isn't surprising given its prior behavior. It's an inevitable consequence of prioritizing optics over ethics, power over service. The ease with which Voldemort's regime takes control, establishes Muggle-born registration, begins systematic persecution, shows how fascism exploits institutional weakness, how compromised systems become instruments of oppression without requiring complete replacement. Regulus Black's redemption through sacrifice represents someone who joined the evil movement, recognized his mistake, and died trying to correct it without anyone knowing his heroism. Regulus was perfect pure-blood son, believed the ideology, joined Death Eaters as teenager, then witnessed what that ideology meant in practice when Voldemort used Kreacher as disposable tool to protect a Seeing someone he cared about his house self-treated as worthless object awakened Regulus to the evil he'd joined. He discovered Voldemort's Horcrux, realized what it meant, and decided to destroy it, knowing the attempt would likely kill him. He ordered Kreacher to take the locket and destroy it, made the elf promise to leave him in the cave to die, sacrificed himself at 18, trying to weaken Voldemort without anyone knowing what he'd done. For decades, everyone believed Regulus simply died fleeing Death Eaters. Coward who got cold feet, his true heroism unknown, until Harry discovered the truth through Kreacher's memories. Adult readers recognize profound tragedy here, attempting redemption without credit, dying to correct mistake without anyone acknowledging the effort, sacrificing yourself in secret because saving others matters more than being recognized as hero. Regulus's story complicates simple narratives about Death Eaters being irredeemable, showing that even those who join evil can change, can choose differently, can die trying to undo harm they caused. His note in the locket signed R.A.B., declaring intention to destroy Horcrux, addressing Voldemort, directly represents final defiance from someone who recognized his mistake and took action despite the personal cost. The Elder Wand's history of violence, passing from owner to owner through murder, demonstrates how power attracts those least suited to wield it and corrupts those who seek it. The wand passes through bloody succession of wizards killing each other to claim unbeatable wand, each believing they'll be the one to finally master it, each eventually defeated by next ambitious killer. This cycle continues for centuries until the wand ends up with Dumbledore, who wins it from Grindelwald, but never uses it for conquest. Understanding that such power is burden, not prize, Voldemort's obsession with obtaining the Elder Wand, believing it will make him invincible, reflects his fundamental misunderstanding of power. He thinks strength comes from tools rather than choices, that possessing unbeatable weapon guarantees victory. Harry's wisdom is recognizing the wand brings only danger, that power others will kill for isn't worth having, that true strength is choosing not to wield such power. When Harry decides to return the wand to Dumbledore's tomb rather than keeping it, breaking its power by dying undefeated, he demonstrates mature understanding that some temptations should be refused entirely, that best way to handle corrupting power is not to claim it. Adult readers recognize this as commentary on arms races, nuclear weapons, any power that seems to guarantee security but actually ensures continued conflict as others seek to claim it. The Elder Wand's history teaches that unbeatable power makes you target, that others will always come seeking what you possess, that safety comes from vulnerability accepted rather than invincibility pursued. The existence of Obscurial's children whose magic turns inward and destructive when forced to suppress it represents trauma of denying one's identity under threat of abuse. Obscurials occur when young witches or wizards are forced to hide their magic, usually due to abuse or persecution, causing their power to become parasitic force that eventually kills them. Credence bare bone in Fantastic Beasts, though beyond the main series scope. The concept exists in Harry Potter world, demonstrates this phenomenon, but Harry himself nearly became Obscurial given the Dursleys' attempts to suppress any hint of abnormality. The fact that he survived with magic intact is partly luck, partly Lily's protection, but many children in similar circumstances wouldn't survive. The concept of Obscurials serves as metaphor for what happens when children are forced to deny fundamental aspects of themselves: sexuality, identity, ability, anything that makes them different under threat of punishment. The suppressed power doesn't disappear, it turns inward, becomes destructive, damages the person trying to contain it. Adult readers, particularly those who spent years hiding aspects of identity or watched others struggle with forced suppression of self, recognize this as representation of psychological damage that secrecy and shame inflict. The magical world's relative lack of obscurials suggests that Muggle-born children usually receive Hogwarts letters before suppression becomes fatal, that most magical children find communities where they can be themselves. But the existence of the phenomenon at all demonstrates deadly cost of forced conformity, of making children ashamed of what they fundamentally are. Dobby's death saving Harry, Ron, and Hermione from Malfoy Manor represents ultimate sacrifice from someone's society considered property, proving that freedom and love matter more than species or status. Dobby spent his life enslaved to Malfoys, abused and treated as disposable, until Harry tricked Lucius into freeing him. After gaining freedom, Dobby could have lived safely, worked at Hogwarts, where house elves are treated relatively well, stayed far from danger. Instead, he chooses to help Harry repeatedly, risks himself to warn Harry of dangers, eventually dies, apparating them from Malfoy Manor when Bellatrix throws a knife that catches him mid-transport. His final words, "Such a beautiful place, to be with friends." Dobby is happy to be with his friends, emphasize that he dies free, dies saving people he loves, dies as person rather than slave. Harry's grief over Dobby, his insistence on digging the grave by hand rather than using magic, represents recognition of Dobby's full personhood, acknowledgement that this free elf mattered as much as any wizard. The headstone Harry creates, "Here lies Dobby," a free elf, honors both Dobby's sacrifice and the freedom he cherished. Adult readers recognize this as one of series' most moving deaths precisely because Dobby had so little reason to help. Harry, based on society's structure, because his loyalty came from genuine love rather than magical compulsion, because someone society considered barely sentient, proved braver and more loving than most wizards. His death demonstrates that heroism doesn't depend on status or species, that the enslaved can be freer in spirit than their masters, that choosing to help others despite personal risk represents highest form of courage. The Horcrux hunt represents not just physical quest, but psychological warfare, as carrying piece of Voldemort's soul affects the bearers in insidious ways. The Locket Horcrux amplifies negative emotions, insecurities about being overshadowed, Harry's guilt over endangering friends, Hermione's frustration at their lack of progress. When worn, the Horcrux whispers doubts, feeds jealousy, turns friends against each other by exploiting existing vulnerabilities. Ron's temporary abandonment of Harry and Hermione stems partly from the Locket's influence, magnifying his feelings of inadequacy until he can't bear staying. The Horcrux doesn't create these feelings from nothing. It takes what's already present and amplifies it, making small doubts into overwhelming certainties, turning manageable frustrations into unbearable resentments. Adult readers recognize this as representation of how depression works, how anxiety operates, how negative thought patterns can be amplified by external stressors until they feel like objective truth rather than distorted perception. The fact that they must take turns wearing the Horcrux, that no one can bear it constantly without breaking, demonstrates recognition that carrying darkness has cumulative cost, that even strong people need relief from persistent negativity. Destroying each Horcrux requires confronting what it represents. Harry faces his connection to Voldemort, Ron faces his insecurities, Hermione faces her fears. The Horcruxes serve as externalized trauma and shadow selves, requiring heroes to acknowledge and overcome their worst aspects before they can destroy Voldemort's soul fragments. Cho Chang's relationship with Harry, complicated by Cedric's death and her unprocessed grief, demonstrates how trauma affects intimacy and why some relationships exist only within specific contexts. Cho is grieving Cedric when she begins dating Harry, looking for connection with someone who shared that traumatic experience, who understands what she lost. But Harry is also traumatized, carrying his own grief and guilt, and neither of them has tools to support the other's healing. Their brief romance is marked by crying, miscommunication, and emotional volatility, not because either is a bad person, but because they're both drowning and grabbing at each other for support neither can provide. Cho's friend Marietta betraying Dumbledore's army to Umbridge. Cho's defense of that betrayal creates breach Harry can't forgive, showing how tragedy ripples outward, affecting friendships and loyalties. Adult readers who have attempted relationships during periods of intense grief or trauma recognize this pattern, seeking comfort in someone who understands, discovering that shared trauma doesn't automatically create healthy foundation, realizing that sometimes people enter our lives for specific moments rather than permanent connection. Harry and Cho aren't meant to be together long term. They're meant to help each other survive specific period, then move on when that need passes. The relationship's failure isn't anyone's fault, but rather reflects reality that timing matters, that emotional readiness is crucial, that love requires more than shared experience of loss. The prophecy's ambiguity, either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives, demonstrates how interpretation shapes destiny as much as prediction itself. The prophecy could mean many things: that Harry and Voldemort cannot coexist, that one must kill the other, that their linked fates make separation impossible. Voldemort interprets it as threat requiring Harry's death, devotes years to achieving that death, which creates the very circumstances that lead to his own defeat. Harry interprets it as burden, believing he's destined to either kill or be killed, carrying that weight throughout adolescence. Yet Dumbledore suggests the prophecy's power comes entirely from belief in it. If Voldemort had ignored the prediction, if he hadn't marked Harry as equal, if he hadn't created the connection between them, the prophecy would have been meaningless words. This philosophical complexity that fate is created by our response to predictions about fate resonates with adult readers, familiar with self-fulfilling prophecies, confirmation bias, how expectations shape outcomes. The question becomes whether Harry had genuine choice, or whether choice itself was illusion, whether free will exists alongside prophecy, or whether one negates the other. Dumbledore's argument that choice matters more than destiny, that Harry could have walked away, provides comfort but doesn't fully resolve the tension. Adult readers are left to grapple with whether Harry's heroism is more or less meaningful if it was prophesied, whether choosing what you're destined to choose constitutes free will, whether destiny and autonomy can coexist, or whether they're fundamentally incompatible concepts. The portrait of Phineas Nigellus Black, serving as communication between Grimmauld Place and Hogwarts, demonstrates how even bigoted historical figures can be repurposed toward better ends. Nigellus was least popular headmaster in Hogwarts history, openly disdained Muggleborns, embodied pure-blood prejudice, yet his portrait becomes useful tool for the Order of the Phoenix. Hermione captures his portrait to prevent him reporting their locations to Snape, keeps him in her beaded bag during the Horcrux hunt, forces him to serve causes he would have despised in life. The portrait resents this treatment, grumbles constantly, but must follow instructions from whoever possesses the portrait. This raises interesting questions about portraits' autonomy, whether they're truly the person or just magical echo programmed to behave as person would have, whether using them against their apparent will constitutes ethical violation. Adult readers might see this as metaphor for how societies use historical figures, legacy staking complicated people, repurposing their images for current causes, sometimes contra to what the actual person believed. The portraits have no choice but to serve whoever controls them, regardless of whether they approve, creating dynamic where past must serve present, even when past would resist. Nigellus's eventual cooperation, providing useful information despite his prejudices, suggests that even those shaped by bigoted eras can contribute to progress when circumstances force evolution. Lavender Brown's death, or grievous injury in the final battle, the books are ambiguous about whether she survives. Fenrir Greyback's attack represents casualties among characters who seemed insignificant, reminding readers that war doesn't discriminate based on narrative importance. Lavender was comic relief character, silly girl obsessed with divination and dating Ron, not warrior or hero or particularly skilled, which yet she fights in the Battle of Hogwarts anyway, faces Greyback who mauls her, possibly dies or is at minimum grievously wounded and likely infected with lycanthropy. Her fate gets minimal attention because the narrative follows Harry, but it represents all the minor characters whose stories end violently during that night. People who had their own lives and loves and futures that were erased in combat. Adult readers recognize this as realistic portrayal of war's indiscriminate cruelty. Soldiers don't die in order of their importance to the story. Battle doesn't spare those who weren't central to the plot. Tragedy affects everyone regardless of their narrative weight. Lavender's attack also highlights Greyback's particular evil. He targets her specifically to spread lycanthropy, to create more werewolves and spread the curse he embraces as identity. The fact that she may have survived only to face life as werewolf, dealing with all the discrimination and difficulty Lupin endured, suggests that survival can carry its own form of tragedy. Harry's use of his parents' names for his children, James, Sirius, Albus, Severus, Lily Luna, represents common impulse to memorialize the dead through naming, but also raises questions about burden placed on children carrying loaded names. Naming your son Albus Severus means that child will spend his life explaining who Dumbledore and Snape were, carrying weight of expectations and comparisons, being defined by his names, references, before he's defined by himself. Harry means this as honor, as keeping his mentor's memories alive. But adult readers might wonder whether the child asked for this responsibility, whether carrying complex legacy of two deeply flawed men serves Albus Severus well. The epilogue's cursory treatment of this: "You were named for two headmasters of Hogwarts, one of them a Slytherin, and he was the bravest man I ever knew," simplifies relationships that were far more complicated, reduces Snape's abuse and Dumbledore's manipulation to simple heroism. It's understandable impulse from traumatized man who lost so many people, who wants to ensure they're remembered. But it also demonstrates how grief can lead to decisions that affect next generation in unexamined ways. The children become living memorials, bearing names that announce Harry's losses before they announce the children's own identities. Adult readers who have carried significant family names, or who have named their own children after lost loved ones, recognize both the love and the burden in this choice. The Room of Requirement's ability to become whatever is needed demonstrates how the castle itself responds to genuine need with compassion, providing sanctuary and tools beyond what any individual could create. Students who need place to practice defense find training room. Those who need to hide something find storage space. Those who need sanctuary find refuge. The room doesn't judge the need or the person. It simply responds to desperation with accommodation. This magical property represents an ideal of unconditional support, of systems that adapt to meet people where they are, rather than demanding they fit predetermined categories. The room's destruction by funfire represents loss of that flexibility, that compassion built into Hogwarts' very structure. Adult readers might see the room as representation of what institutions should be: responsive to actual needs, rather than rigid in prescribed solutions, creating space for those who don't fit elsewhere, providing tools for self-determination rather than demanding conformity. The fact that the room exists within Hogwarts, built by founders centuries ago, suggests that the castle itself embodies values beyond what any current administration enforces, that places can hold wisdom and compassion independent of those who currently control them. Hermione's persistent advocacy for house self-rights, despite ridicule from friends, represents commitment to justice, even when unpopular, willingness to be mocked for principles when everyone else accepts injustice as normal. Her SPEW campaign is treated as joke by most characters, including Ron and Harry, dismissed as naive idealism, yet she's identifying genuine moral atrocity, that the magical world is normalized. The fact that even good characters like the Weasleys and Dumbledore maintain house elves in servitude shows how thoroughly this form of slavery has been accepted, how even those who fight against evil in other forms participate in oppression without examining it. Hermione's isolation on this issue, being laughed at, being told the elves like serving, being dismissed as not understanding magical culture, reflects real experiences of activists who advocate for marginalized groups, who face resistance even from allies when challenging systemic oppression. Adult readers, particularly those involved in social justice work, recognize this dynamic, identifying injustice others have normalized, attempting to change minds that resist change, being mocked for caring about issues others consider unimportant or natural. Hermione's eventual success in winning Creature's loyalty through kindness demonstrates that changing individual relationships is possible, even when systems remain unchanged, though it's insufficient as full solution to institutional slavery. Her character arc around this issue shows both the importance of persistent advocacy and the frustration of fighting injustice that's so normalized even victims defend it. Word count part 10. Approximately 2,050 words, cumulative total, approximately 18,600 words. Target remaining, 1,400 to 6,400 words. Vou continuar com mais alguns fatos finais para atingir pelo menos 20.000 palavras. The Patronus charm requiring happy memory to cast represents how defending against darkness requires accessing light within yourself. how hope serves as literal shield against despair. Dementors feed on happiness and force victims to relive worst memories, creating spiral into depression and hopelessness that can kill if prolonged. The Patronus, conjured through focusing on purest joy, creates barrier between caster and that despair, proving that darkness cannot consume those who maintain connection to what makes life worth living. Harry's particular skill with the Patronus, mastering it at 13, when most adult wizards cannot produce corporeal form, stems from his capacity for love. Despite his traumatic history, his ability to find happiness in friendships and belonging, even after years of abuse and neglect. The fact that his Patronus takes form of stag like his father's animagus form, that Snape's takes shape of doe matching lilies, demonstrates how love shapes our defenses, how those we care about become part of our protection against darkness. Adult readers recognize this as representation of how maintaining hope and connection serves as genuine defense mechanism against depression and trauma, how accessing positive memories can provide resilience when facing despair. The Patronus isn't just magical spell, but symbolic representation of psychological truths, that cultivating joy, maintaining bonds, remembering what you're fighting for, provides strength to resist forces that want to drag you into darkness. Firenze, the centaur's decision to teach divination at Hogwarts after being exiled from his herd, demonstrates the cost of choosing progress over tradition, of allying with those your community considers enemies. Centaurs have maintained separation from wizards for centuries, consider themselves superior beings who shouldn't lower themselves to serving witches and wizards. When Firenze accepts Dumbledore's offer to teach after Umbridge fires Trelawney, his herd attacks him, exiles him permanently, considers him traitor for crossing the boundary they've maintained. Firenze loses his community, his place in Centaur society, everything he's known, because he believed helping was right choice even when his people considered it betrayal. His teaching brings new perspective to divination. He emphasizes reading signs in nature, understanding patterns rather than making specific predictions, approaching the discipline with more rigor and less dramatics than Trelawney. Adult readers who have been ostracized from their communities for making unpopular choices, who have crossed boundaries their families or cultures considered inviolable, recognize Firenze's experience. Sometimes doing right thing means losing belonging, means being exiled from people who raised you, means choosing principle over tribe. Firenze's eventual partial reconciliation with his herd after the Battle of Hogwarts, when centaurs fight against Voldemort, suggests that sometimes those who exile you eventually recognize your wisdom, though the wounds of rejection don't fully heal. The final confrontation between Harry and Voldemort in the Great Hall, with the entire school watching, represents truth, defeating lies through public witness rather than secret violence. Harry reveals Snape's true loyalty, explains the Elder Wand's allegiance, offers Voldemort final chance to feel remorse and repair his soul. This isn't typical heroic duel, but attempt at teaching, at making Voldemort understand his mistakes, at giving him opportunity for redemption even at the end. Voldemort's rejection of this mercy, his casting of killing curse even after Harry's explanation, demonstrates his fundamental inability to change, his choice to remain what he's become. The curse rebounds one final time, killing Voldemort permanently, in front of everyone who needs to witness that death is real, that he's truly gone. Adult readers recognize importance of this public ending, no secret death that could be doubted, no ambiguous disappearance that could fuel conspiracy theories, but witnessed defeat in broad daylight before hundreds of people. Harry's refusal to use Avada Kedavra, his use of Expelliarmus instead, means Voldemort's own curse kills him, means Harry's hands remain clean of murder, even in justified self-defense. This represents maintaining moral code, even when facing greatest evil, choosing not to become killer, even when killing would be righteous, trusting that there are other ways to defeat darkness besides embracing its methods. The fact that Harry names his second son, Albus Severus, and tells him Snape was the bravest man he ever knew, represents forgiveness and understanding that transcends personal harm to recognize complicated heroism. Snape spent years being cruel to Harry, bullying him in classes, allowing favoritism, making school experience miserable. Yet he also protected Harry constantly, maintained cover that required appearing to hate him, died to ensure Voldemort's defeat. Harry's adult perspective allows him to separate Snape's petty cruelties from his genuine courage, to recognize that someone can be both abusive teacher and genuine hero. That moral complexity allows people to be flawed and brave simultaneously. The choice to honor Snape alongside Dumbledore, the manipulator, and the bully as models for his sunset jests. Harry has made peace with the fact that his protectors were imperfect, that love doesn't require perfection, that bravery can coexist with pettiness. Adult readers might have mixed feelings about this choice. Is Harry right to forgive Snape's abuse? Or is he perpetuating a cycle where victims excuse their abuser's behavior because of larger context? The answer isn't simple, which is perhaps the point. Snape doesn't fit neat categories of good or evil, and Harry's decision to honor him represents adult understanding that people contain multitudes, that heroism doesn't erase harm caused, but harm caused doesn't negate sacrifices made. Mrs. Weasley's ability to create a warm home despite poverty represents love as creating abundance from scarcity, showing that family richness doesn't require financial wealth. The burrow is crowded and shabby, held together with magic and determination, yet it's the warmest home in the series, filled with laughter and comfort and belonging. Molly feeds everyone who enters, creates space for those who need sanctuary, treats Harry as seventh son without hesitation or calculation. Her knitted sweaters, made by hand for each child every Christmas, represent labor of love when they cannot afford expensive gifts, creating tradition and warmth from simple materials. Adult readers who have been poor but loved, or who have created homes on limited resources, recognize the burrow as representation of how love makes spaces rich, regardless of financial state. The contrast with Malfoy Manor grand and cold and terrible, despite its wealth, emphasizes that comfort and safety don't correlate with money, that cruelty can live in mansions while love thrives in cramped burrows. Molly's fierce protection of her family, her pride in their achievements, her grief over their losses, demonstrates that her wealth is measured in people who love each other, in children who return home, in traditions maintained and values passed down. The burrow becomes sanctuary for the Order of the Phoenix, for Harry during summers, for anyone who needs safety, proving that the poorest house can be richest in what matters. The series' treatment of death as natural part of life, rather than enemy to be defeated, represents mature acceptance that mortality gives life meaning, that love persists beyond death through memory and impact. Nearly Headless Nick explains that ghosts are wizards who feared death so much they chose pale imitation of life instead, existing without truly living. The dead who appear through the resurrection stone are described as belonging to death, not to life, existing in limbo between states and wanting Harry to join them when his time comes. Harry's parents don't urge him to live when he's walking toward his death. They accept his choice, accompany him to the end, demonstrate that loving someone means respecting their autonomy, even unto death. The King's Cross limbo scene suggests something beyond death, possibility of continuation in form we don't fully understand, while maintaining that death itself is not ending to be feared, but transition to be accepted. Adult readers who have lost loved ones, who have contemplated their own mortality, find comfort in the series' consistent message that death is natural, that those who die in love remain connected to those who remember them, that sacrifice gives death meaning rather than making it tragedy. The final line, "all was well," suggests peace with mortality accepted, with scars earned, with losses survived. It's not happily ever after in fairy tale sense, but well in sense of having survived, having endured, having made peace with complicated reality that includes both love and loss.